Tonight we're starting a brand new unit, and this is Unit 6. You can see the topics. One of the bigger topics here is working with forms, a very important construct, really in any computer programming environment. And then we're also going to be looking at multimedia and some of the stuff that comes with it. We're going to start with Chapter 9. I'm going to go ahead and start my PowerPoint presentation here as per usual. Here's our outcomes for the chapter. Seems like a pretty simple little list. You know, forms in a lot of textbooks usually occupy one chapter, which is, I'd say appropriate. But it is a pretty deep subject. There's a lot to learn about it, and there's a lot of little nuances. Our goal here is to get you to be able to create a form that accepts information, and you understand all the different parameters that go with it. All right, so what is a form? You guys have been on web pages. You go to Google, you got that box in the middle, you click in it, right? That text field, you may have learned this in the Intro to Programming also, that's input, that's a form element. The button that you click on is a form element, the little checkbox, the little radio button, the little sliders, the drop downs, all those are form elements. Those are all things that we can put onto a page using some HTML tags. And typically we use them to gather information or to elicit interactivity from the user. That's the purpose of it. What good is a web page that you just look at? Clicking a link is fine, but usually we like it to do something. Forms are where we start to step out of some of the staticness of HTML and start ramping it up into actual applications. And forms are really kind of an important way to provide that interactivity. Here's a little example of a form, and we'll probably build something very similar to this to start with, where we have just a collection, usually of text boxes. They'll have labels that go next to all the form fields, and maybe a couple little extra types and a button or two. That's the kind of thing that we're going to be doing. All right, so a couple of components of working with forms that are pretty important. Obviously, it's the stuff that we create on the page. That's going to be our primary focus in this course. In order for a form to actually do something as you would anticipate it would do, like for example, you go to a website, you buy a product, type in your credit card number, and it sends off somewhere into the ether, and magically funds are subtracted from your account. All that stuff that happens on the back end or the server side, and you're going to see this terminology here. All the stuff that we're learning in this class is client side, meaning stuff that works on the user's device in their browser. Does not require a server to do anything aside from provide the file. Processing on the server happens by virtue of running a program on the web server that you're connecting to. So in other words, if I fill out a form and I want the form to actually do something, we have to write programming code that sits on the server and executes when the form is submitted. That's not what we're doing here. We are learning to create the form. As you move forward in the program, you get to more advanced levels, you will do a lot with forms, where you do pretty sophisticated operations. All right, but it gives you an idea of what happens server side. So really forms in and of themselves don't really do a lot, but you got to learn how to put them together before you can have them do a lot. All right, really basic example of putting a form together, and I should probably start a text file here where we can start throwing in some elements. Help me build my HTML document really quick. And I'm doing this, it's even going into the recording here because you guys should be in the habit of building a page, building it quickly at this point, I hope. And can you see the pattern that I'm employing here? I'm putting it together in sections. Any tag I open, I immediately close. That just keeps me from making mistakes later. Now, of course, if you followed my instructions probably on the first night of class, you probably have a template file saved and you don't have to do all this, right? That would be the smart thing. But even if you have to do it, it's okay. And we're going to stick with some pretty basic stuff to start with here. So, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually come up here and hopefully this code, I'll be able to paste it directly from the PowerPoint. Oh boy, that's not pretty. That's why you don't want to copy from PowerPoints or Word documents or ebooks. You get this kind of result. But what you're going to see here is just some of the real basics of putting a form together. Notice we have a couple different input types, and we're going to talk about all these, so no need to get too ahead of yourselves. We have a couple of items here that are kind of weird. Type submit and type reset. You can probably guess what they are. Buttons. And this is one of those empty text boxes. We have some text, but everything sits within a form tag. So this is a pretty typical setup. And then notice this is what the form may look like. And this is very simplistic. But I'm going to start to build a form as I'm going through this lecture so you can see it in action. And you should do the same thing. Play with the tags, see how they operate. There's a lot you can do with it. And certainly it won't be limited to the stuff that we learn here in class. All right. When we actually get to the point of creating the form tag itself, the form tag has a number of different attributes that we can apply to it. And I know that some of the stuff that's coming on down the line here, we're going to probably see repeat. And I might jump ahead of where the PowerPoints are at, and if that's the case, we'll kind of skip over the later slides because we talked about it. But what they're indicating here is that the form tag itself, speaking of this particular thing, has a bunch of very standard attributes that we apply. In its most generic form, we can leave it just this simple, and it'll work. It won't do anything, but it'll work. And we created something that looks like something, but not something that actually does something. That's why those attributes are necessary to help us drive what happens. Probably the first thing I should do here, honestly, is I should probably do a save as, and you should do the same. Trying to remember where I keep my Google Drive folder these days. That's pretty sad, isn't it? And not really, because I run so many different machines and it's on a different spot on every machine, it seems. And we've got our Web 1 folder here. What unit is this? Unit 6. Let's create a folder. Yeah, I'm going to call it form page. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. The main reason I'm saving it here is so I can look at it. That's helpful. And also to turn on the color coding so I can see if there's any issues happening. All right, so if we start looking at some of these attributes, and I'm going to start adding them and talking about them. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start from the bottom up. I'm going to give it an ID. It's always a good idea to give something like a form an ID so we can have a unique identifier for it. And I don't know, let's call it contact form. The other thing that we're going to add is a name field. Now this is in some ways considered a little bit antiquated, but in terms of getting JavaScript to operate properly in certain scenarios, it needs to be present. So when you see this, both on the form itself and on the input fields like this, there's a reason for it. And you'll usually see that the name and the ID match. That's a convention. They don't have to match, but it's really good practice. Next thing I'm going to add is method. All right, so here's where it gets interesting. There's get and there's post. One thing that you should note is that get is the default. In fact, a lot of operations that we do on forums online tend to use the operation of get. And let me demonstrate what a get does. It's kind of funny terminology, I suppose. All right, so here's an example. I go to Google, and with the Chrome browser and most of them now, you can just type a search right in the address field, or I can type it here. So what are we searching for? Packers. Let's just search for Packers. Oh, let's search for Packers schedule. All right. So what I want you to pay attention to is not the search results. What I want you to pay attention to is the URL. And you guys maybe have noticed this in the past. Most people over time eventually kind of tune into the fact that when you type something in, very often if you just start reading through the URL, well, sure enough, it did take me to Google. And it's got all this goofy looking stuff in here. It says web, HP, question mark, source ID, Chrome, dash instant, ampersand, ion equals 1, and ampersand, and yada, 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 yada. But at the very end of it, you'll notice that Q equals Packers plus schedule. So what happened is the stuff I typed into the form, when I hit the button to make it do something, it did a get. The form did a get. It took whatever I typed, converted it, and placed it into the URL. Plainly visible text. So when you fill out a form and you do a get and you're passing the information with a get, mind you, it's the default, all the information in the form gets embedded into the URL. Kind of weird, right? So when you're typing in a password and the form has a get, believe it or not, there was a day and time, and Yahoo was probably the last one to switch it, honestly, that you would go to some websites and you type in the password and the password was there in plain text right in the URL. If you knew where to look, you could grab it. Or if you were sniffing network traffic, right? So not very secure. However, but for search, does it really matter? For some types of things, it really doesn't matter. There are some limitations, though, to using get. Aside from that, and part of it is the amount of data that you can pass. What's considered a little bit more secure is post, and it's passed in a hidden fashion. It'll still take you somewhere, but you won't see it in the URL. Typically, when we're doing server-side interactions, especially if we're moving personal data of some sort or writing stuff to a database, those are more typical. Interacting with an application on the server, typically you will see post in the spot. If you do not declare it, get is default. All right, back to the slide. The last thing is the action attribute. Now the action attribute is responsible for triggering code by virtue of hitting the submit button. The submit button being the button that takes the default action for the form. See how they're intertwined? Now that can be a very simple thing. It might trigger something like process email.php, for example. Now you guys haven't learned PHP yet in the program, but some of you might know a little bit about it. Basically what this would do, if this was the case, it would receive the form data, it would send it to a script on the server that would receive the information, store it locally, and then execute code that we wrote. It might just be send the email, or sort the email, or store it in the database, or something like that. And then it requires that script on the server to run in order for it to work. Okay. Now, another approach could be something really simple like this. You can actually have it take you to a different page. And this is what I'm going to teach you initially, is to have a form, fill it out, you hit the button, it looks like it did something, and it takes you to a thank you page. So, for all intents and purposes, it worked, right? But it's not really doing anything. But that's where we're going to start. So, one thing that a form can do is just simply take you somewhere else. More appropriately, it would take you to a document or a program on a server somewhere, or it can directly execute JavaScript right from this spot. So I could write a JavaScript statement right here, or I could point us to a statement of JavaScript, like a method or a function that exists in the JavaScript file. We're not quite there yet, but you'll be there soon. So it's flexible as to what you can do. And there's some good practices and bad practices here, and I'll try to point them out as we go. All right. Let's focus now upon the most fundamental of all these form fields, and that is the text box. And you can see some of the attributes that they have present there. And what I'm going to try to do here, hopefully, is maybe do something like this, so we can start playing with these. Now on this form that we've already started building, you can see that we already have an input that's of type text. Basically all it does is it makes a box that you can type in. You click in it and you type. Everybody knows what these are, right? You've seen these, hopefully. Now, in addition to the name and the ID, which we already have, there's a few other things that we can add in here. One, and you might guess at these right away, would be value. You know what value does? It pre-populates it with a value. That's a little strange. Now, we haven't even looked at our form yet, have we? Okay. Do you see what that did? It pre-populated the form. Have you guys ever been to a website where you clicked on a form and there's something already there? That's how it's done. So you can force a value in. Now, of course, the user can still overwrite it. The other one that they want to show you is max length. And what if we were doing something for like a zip code? Go back to the browser and refresh. Did I do that right? I think I did. Right, but it's not really showing us much. No, well, it's saying 5, but let's go back to the form and try to actually do something. It can be as wide as it wants, but it's only allowing 5 characters. So you can use that to your advantage. Typically, you'll only use that in certain scenarios, like maybe like a zip code or a phone number or something like that. Now, what you probably thought it was going to do is what size does, which is brings the actual size of the form field down. So you see how it made it smaller? Are there any other things that they're pointing out here? Nope, I think we covered those. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that this is not the limit of what you can use for attributes in a form field. There's many other things, but we're going to take this kind of in the pattern that the book is offering it. All right, our next slide, we're going to be taking a look at another type of thing that you've probably seen, and this is called a text area. And this is actually kind of a weird one sequence-wise to present here, I think. This is one of the most oddball of all the form elements, because unlike most of them, it has actually an opening and a closing tag. Most of the form elements don't. They're all self-closing. So for example, if we were doing XHTML, we'd have to put that in. Remember I showed you that with some of the other tags? And you can put that in and that's fine. You do not have to. Text area kind of breaks that a little bit, and let's just go ahead and save it and bring up the browser again and do a little bit of refresh here. So you see what that does. It just kind of sits there though. It doesn't really do anything too fancy. Did you guys ever notice this little like weird thing in the corner? This little hash marks down there? Do you know that you can grab them and change the size of the box? Because a lot of people don't know that. So I always like to point it out. It might be new for you. If so, wonderful. Some of the attributes we can add here. It's always a good idea to add an ID. Now I'm calling it comments because that's typical use for a box like this. And then if you add something in between the tags and then refresh your page, guess what that ends up? Inside. Typically that's going to be blank. Okay? But if you wanted to pre-populate it, that's what you would do. You would just put a hi or whatever right there. Other attributes include columns and rows, so that kind of helps you decide how big it is. So for example, if I said column equals 60, no, that's not full resolution. This is full resolution right here. So you see how you can control it? And then you can also add rows. And you know, this is a little bit of a kind of like a hangover from the old days of coding. So columns refers back to the days and time when we used to use monospace fonts, and we had only a certain number of characters we could go across the screen before we had to go to the next line. And this kind of plays off of that. So if you were using a monospace font, the way I set it up, you can only have 60 characters across before it goes to the next line. Pretty simple, really. Now, you can control the size of it. You can just let it be what it is. It's really kind of very subjective. One thing I will add here, though, is I will throw in a line break just to move the buttons down a line. And just do a little refresh there. In fact, if I was doing something like this, what I might opt to do, and I'm kind of recommending, I guess, that you do this. And see, I'm not doing any really fancy formatting here at all. Very simple little tweaks. Just creating a little bit of space. Okay. I don't like 60 columns. I like 30 columns. All right, let's move on. Well, that's pretty good to know too, that if you happened to fill in the whole text box, and that's one of the points the author is making here, you get scroll bars. See that? And that's automatic. You know, because some people have the question, what happens if you fill it? Well, that's what happens. All right. Another thing that we have is the input submit button. Notice we already created one of those. And the code is actually really simple. We just say input type submit. That automatically implies a button. Now, I want to clarify. We do have inputs of type button as well. But the submit button, when pressed, is what triggers the action listed at the top of the form. So I can create a button that does other things that does not trigger the action. That's an important consideration. So please keep that in mind. Once again, good idea to put in an ID and a name and a value if you wish. In terms of what we're doing here, I'm pretty much going to leave it as is for right now. It's considered really good practice to always give things IDs and names, but I'm breaking those rules, at least for a few moments. Now the reset button, once again, that's another one of these default buttons that's just built in. By just simply saying type reset, what do you suppose it does? It clears the form. Now, of course, this one didn't clear because I'm forcing a value into it, right? And honestly, I probably should get rid of all this stuff here. You guys have seen how it works now? Okay. Let's do a refresh. You want to test that reset? You want to test the submit? Type in some stuff. Well, it's not going to find it because that file's not there, right? But we're gonna build that file soon too. So now, a lot of people aren't in the habit of including reset buttons on forms. At least that's kind of a, stylistically it's something that people have moved away from. But you still see it. Often it was considered a kind of a courtesy. So what they have here at this point in the PowerPoint, that's kind of funny to say, right? At this point in the PowerPoint, is they have a little hands-on practice. What they're challenging us to do is go ahead and create this form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do that. You guys should follow along with me. So let's see if we can build something that's very common on a lot of websites. So we have first name, last name, email, and comments. Well, I already have email, right? That's part of my work is done. But I'm also going to need to create first name. Don't reinvent the wheel. You can copy paste. The name of this I'm going to call first name with an ID of. You could also abbreviate these if you choose. Now, first name's not much different than last name, so I'm going to copy paste again. So we have first name, last name, email, and comments. One thing I noticed here, though, is this submit button doesn't say submit. That's something we can adjust by putting in a value. Let's go ahead and save our work. I am going to jump away from this for a moment so you guys can copy it as soon as I come back. All right. One thing we're missing, though, right? Well, if we're going to make it just like that, we may as well make it just like that. So above the form here, looks like they have, I'm guessing, an H1. And this is a good little exercise, really, because it's a very common thing to have contact forms on websites. I always have an issue of like how often is it actually used, but it's a convention, and you really should learn how to do it because it's a good first type of exercise. All right, I will be putting that back up on the screen. Some more input types to check out. This one's pretty cool. So we have input, now what's fascinating about this This is the password field. I didn't label it, but the only thing that's really remarkable about this is when you type, notice how it converts your characters to little dots. That's all the password field does. It's meant to visually obscure your password information from anybody looking over your shoulder. It does not obscure the information in transit. The only way to obscure it in transit is make sure you set to post and encrypt the communication. So if you're on a website like this, and you got to look for that little S in the address, HTTPS. If that's not there and you're typing in a password or a credit card number, you got some issues, some risk, okay? Please be mindful. All right, another thing that's kind of cool, the checkbox. May as well say password right here. And this is one that you see pretty often as well. Now what I'm doing here is I'm trying to mimic kind of what they have on the screen. What else am I missing? We won't include Internet Explorer anymore. Has anybody downloaded Opera and played with it at all? If you're a web developer, you need to play with it and try it, especially if you've never seen it before. All right, I'm going to bring up the browser one more time so we can look at the results of what we're doing. It looks like I need to put a line break right here. Now the one thing you need to know about checkboxes. Checkboxes have the property that you are allowed to select as many of them as you want. If I'm going to pass a value associated with it, notice that I had to set the value box to indicate the value that the form is going to pass to wherever it's going. And you can put in there whatever you wish. Could be a number, could be words, any sort of plain text. All right, the type is checkbox. There's a name and an ID. Names for scripting, IDs for styling. Value is for the information that's passed. All right, next one, another real common type of control is called the radio button. All right, now this is a little different. The thing that's interesting about a radio button is, unlike a checkbox, depending on how you set it up, of course, you can only select one of these at a time. You're not allowed to select multiple ones if you set it up correctly. You see the catch there. That's exactly correct. Okay, the type for these is radio. Again, you should have a name. We should probably put in some descriptive text above it. And let's change what we typed here. Right, because you can only have one favorite. See my rationale there? Oh, we should also do this. It's going to need some text by it. Let's take a look, and let's see if I did it correctly. Do you guys notice one thing that I did here? Name and ID are the same for all of them, because only one can be selected. So that means if you operated a script on it, only one could operate. That's why we use one of them. There's also something kind of interesting here that you can add as an attribute, and I'm going to go full screen. So I'm going to add another thing here to the checkbox just so you can see. What do you suppose that one does? Yeah, it actually, well, I guess it didn't work. All right, what did I do wrong, folks? Oh, I think we'll have to check my syntax here. Is my browser refreshing? Okay, I better check my code. Oops, the teacher made a mistake. Let's erase it really quick. All right, I'll check my syntax. I thought that was the syntax. All right, could be that I also have broken code, which is why it's doing it. So, yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, you know what, Sabrina, I think you're right. I'm thinking, oh, you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking those little drop downs. I think that's enough to make it work, actually. There we go. So you can say checked equals checked, or you can just say checked, and it pre-checks it for you. Which is your favorite? Chrome. And that tends to be most people's answers these days, anyhow. So, all right. There's another interesting thing that you can do. I'm not going to add this to the page, but you should be aware of it. That you can also create controls that are hidden. Now, you can hide any type of control, but usually it's a text box, and one that's got usually a predefined value to it. So a good example of why you might use something like that is, let's say you were on a website and you were ordering something and you had something in your shopping cart, and in order to ship something, we need to know the weight of the product, right? The user doesn't necessarily care what the weight of the product is for shipping calculations, but the shipping software certainly does. So something we might put in a hidden form field is the actual weight. And I used to use this when I would do e-commerce sites. I would use several hidden fields. One would be like credit card transaction IDs, the shipping weight, the dimensional weight. Do you guys know what that is? The girth of a package, because they charge not only on weight, but length, width, height, certain combinations. Because that like UPS, for example, has an 80-inch girth before it goes to oversize, and that's like wrapped all the way around the package and then around one side. There's a formula to it. But all that stuff's really important in getting the correct shipping calculation, but it's not something really the user needs to see. So it's a way for you to pass information to the server when appropriate. All right. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. And this is the select list, and that works in tandem with option. And, really, I mean, I'm assuming at some point they go into the details on this, and I know your book does. But a really good guide on stuff like this, believe it or not, is W3. And you'll see that this is a lot easier to copy code from here than for me to type it. I'm not cheating, I promise. I just figured this would make it go a little faster. You see my browser's choking on my clicks here a little bit, though. All right, and I'm going to copy that and put it in here. Let's put that right here. We'll do a couple of line breaks. Probably a good idea to indent all this stuff. All right, so you can see in its most primitive form, the select box basically defines a set of options. When I save this and render it, actually it's right here. So you get a little simple little drop down. You can also, that selected option I was working with, that works with the option. So I can say here, selected, save it. Now Volvo is going to appear anyhow at the top because it's first. So let's put it on Audi. See how that's handy? Now, why might you put in a selected? Well, like what if you had an online form for signing up for your neighborhood association, right? You assume that all the people live in Wisconsin. It's a pretty safe guess. So you would pre-select Wisconsin. But you could have absentee owners too, right? They could live in Florida half the year. All right, next. All right, we did the options, and now we're at a checkpoint. which we're skipping over. And what we're going to do now is we are going to take a break. I know it's a little bit on the early side, and I'm going to create a fresh video to continue. Okay, so let's do that.